Hello and welcome to part 3 of the tutorial series How to make a sandbox visual novel in visual novel machinery. In this video we'll be looking into the dialog input system, the memory system, and how to rename characters and use their new name in the dialog text. This guide will focus on how to do specific things in visual novel machinery, not on how to write the perfect story in Sandbox. So let's get started. Last time we left off in the dialogs folder with our scene 1. Since then, I have already started cleaning up scene 1 and only left behind the first note, which is Hello World. Because all of the other things we did last time we will not need for this tutorial. So now let's get into this. First things first, sometimes we want to get input from the player. So how will we do this? In visual novel machinery, we have a node called player input or dialog player input, which will show the player a text box and then take the text that the player has entered and pass it through this node with the player input string pin. Now let's try this out immediately. So let's copy the dialog text, and again, like we learned in the previous tutorial, use a dialog text pin, and we use format text again to write our variable text. In this case, we just want to say you have entered curly brackets 0. Maybe let's also add something here as well. Now let's add the player input into 0 here. And let's immediately go ahead and try it out. So we press play, start game, hello world, and we get our text box. Here let's enter something like Towny Town. And as we can see, we have entered Towny Town, which tells us the input system is working as expected. So let's move on. Now, not all the time we might, but often we might not always want to have a string input, but maybe we would also like something like an integer. For this case, for example, the age of the character. For this case, I have created a variable already of type integer called age. Now, let's try this out immediately. But first, let's adapt the text. Because if we say hello world and then enter input, the player would not know what we want them to enter. So let's ask the player, how old am I? Basically, Bob is asking them that they give Bob his age. Now we can add a setter for the age, and we can connect this up. Now, one important thing is a string is not an integer. So normally if you would pull now the player input pin to the age pin, it should normally not work. But Unreal Engine knows how to convert strings to integers and automatically added a compact pin for us, a compact node for us that converts the player input to the age. And now we can directly use this in our format text. Let's also change the text that we are printing out. So instead of you have entered, we are saying I am wildcard years old. So we have compiled and saved, and now let's play. So we start the game, and Bob is asking us how old is he? In his case, he is 64 years old. So Bob is correctly 64 years old. Now, what happens if we would want to use the age in a different dialog? Let's for this purpose create a second dialog. So we go into our dialogs folder, right click, visual novel machinery, and dialog blueprint. And let's call it Scene 2. When you add a new dialog, make sure that you have also added it to the dialog definitions as a new dialog. So let's duplicate scene 1 And as also previously mentioned with the characters, also for dialogues, the row name has to be exactly the same as the dialog ID. Otherwise, something will not work as expected. Then here we have also the dialog title. This is displayed in the choice graph, which is not relevant for us right now because we are not planning on using the choice graph for a sandbox game. Then we have the dialog object class. This is the actual dialog blueprint that we have created. Make sure you set this to something to the correct class or in general something and not none, because if you set it to none, then basically it will just be like not being able to find the next dialog and just leave to the main menu. Then we have the dialog description. The dialog description is same with the character description, some extra information that you can use for yourself in the table to know what's happening in which scene, or if you write your own custom UI, you can display it somewhere in your custom UI. Then we have the dialog background override. This one is relevant because sometimes we want to have a different dialog background displayed when we are in a specific dialog. For example, you are in a dialog that's in the overworld, and then we are in the dialog that's taking place in hell maybe, and then you want a fiery background instead of a very plain, simple background. Then we have the dialog memory definitions. Same as the character definitions, just on the basis of each specific dialogue. So instead of the brain of a character, it's the brain of a scene. And last but not least, we have the voiceover definitions. The voiceover definitions are same with the character voiceover definitions, same as with the dialog memory definitions. We have two systems, so you can decide if you want to save the voiceover definitions for a dialogue or for a character. It's your personal preference, which one you prefer more. So now that we have added scene 2, let's save this. And let's tell our dialog end node that we want to go to scene 2. Like previously, scene 2 will not show up because we have not opened and closed the scene dialog, the dialog blueprint, and we have not recompiled it. So let's just recompile, and we have scene 2 available here. Now, let's just now take this and move this to our new scene. Now, as you can already see, there's a slight problem here already. As the age variable was previously a variable of the specific blueprint, the scene 1 blueprint, we cannot access it in scene 2. For this reason, the memory system exists, because it saves information across the borders of dialogues. So let's take a look specifically at the first one. So we want to save the age of the character. Now we have two options. Option 1 is we save it to Bob, to the character definition of Bob. So it's literally relevant to Bob. Or we save it to scene 1, saying it's relevant always to scene 1, or it is something that happened in scene 1. For example, you have had a very important decision happening in your game, and that happened in scene 1. So in a different scene, let's say scene 24, you want to know what choice you took in scene 1. So this kind of gives you an idea why you would want to add some memories to a character and some memories to a scene. In our case, we want to add it to Bob the character. So let's go to character definitions and add the memory definition. A memory definition consists of a memory ID and a variable type. In our case, let's call it age, and let's choose an integer. We have multiple different options as data types. A memory can be a Boolean value, so true or false, an integer 64-bit, a float, a string, or a byte. So you have a wide variety of options when creating your memory. In our case, we'll take an integer. You could also consider taking a byte, because maybe your characters never get older than 255, 256. But in our case, let's just say your characters can get really old. So let's take an integer. Now let's get back to scene 2 actually. Now we want to take the memory that, now we want to get this memory and use it in here. So what do? We remember we created our memory in the character definitions. So we will need to use a character memory get node. There's also a dialog memory get node if we added the memory to a dialog. But in this case, we added it to a character. Then on the character memory get node, we can select the character and then select the previously defined memory. This is the memory ID that we gave, that we used, that we gave the memory, and we can confirm memory ID here is H, and it's also H here. Also, as you can see, after you have selected your memory, we automatically get a value pin that has the correct data type already specified. So if H would be a boolean, then this would be a boolean pin. If H would be a string, then this would be a string pin. But in our case, it's an integer pin. So let's add this in here. And now we can press play. Now what will happen is we can write our age here, 32. And we go over to the next dialog, and Bob is still 0 years old. He is a baby. The reason for that is because we didn't set the memory yet. So instead of writing the memory to our variable, to our blueprint variable, we are now going to use the character memory set node. It functions similarly like the dialog memories get node. So we specify the character and we specify the memory ID. And as you can see, we automatically get the value pin again with the correct data type. So let's add our memory into here. We press compile and it automatically saves. We press play. We press start game. We specify our age. So 32 again. And as we can see, I am 32 years old. Bob has grown up rapidly. Awesome. Now, how would we do it if it would be a scene memory? We can look into that as well. It's rather simple. So we go to the dialog definitions, go to scene 1, click on the character memory definitions, the dialog memory definitions, apologies, and let's call this MCH. And again, it is an integer. We save. We go back to our dialog blueprint. Now we are using the memory set node. And as you can see, it's structured similarly as the character memory set node. We specify our scene. We specify the memory ID. Now we can just do this and connect this up to this instead. Compile. And here we can now use a dialog memory get node instead. Well, here's a dialog memory get node. We don't need a setter here. So scene 1 and MCH, and we use it directly here. Compile, save, and start. How old am I? 32. And Bob is still 32 years old. As you can see, the both in terms of nodes work exactly the same. It's just a matter of where you save your memories to. But let's keep this now as a character memory, because it generally makes more sense, at least for me, to save it directly to a character because it's relevant to a specific character and not something else. And now, last but not least, let's check out the character renaming. So, in the case of a sandbox, you might want to be able to give the character a different name. So what we can do is, we can use the dialog text node and have Bob ask us, what is my new name? Bob is not talking about himself in the third person. And then, now we have two special nodes. We have the rename node, the character rename node, and the character interactive rename node. Let's look at the character rename node first. Let's connect this up. So what you can see here is we have a field called character, which again is the character ID, in our case Bob. And the difference between the character rename and the interactive rename is that with character rename, we as developers specify what the new name is. This might be relevant, for example, if you make an Android game and the creator of the Android decides to give the character a new name and the player cannot decide on that. So for example, let's say we rename Bob to Max. So what is my new name? It will set the name to Bob, and then it should also display in the game the new name. So what is my new name? Max. We set it to Max, and now we see he's now no longer called Bob, but Max. And if we move on to the next dialog, you will see it also remembers this across dialog borders. Now, what do we do if we want to use the name in an actual dialog text? Because now if we say my new name is Bob, the problem is no matter what we do, it will always say Bob. So we need to have the option to display the correct name. To do that, there's a special specifier that you can use, and it's written like this. So you use $C$, and then the character ID that should be the ID of the character whose name we want to display. In this case, it's Bob, and then $. So $C$, character ID, $. Now if we compile and save and press play again and start, what is my new name? Max, and my new name is Max. Now we now know how to do character renaming, but also let's look into interactive renaming just so that we have seen that as well. So we connect this up and we specify the character again, but as you can see, the difference to the previous node is that we do not have a text box shown where we can input the character name, because it will be shown to the player instead and give the player the option to specify how they want to have the character named. So in our case, what is my new name? And his new name is Alfred. And as you can see, it works perfectly the same as before. Alright, so now we know how to use the dialog input system, we know how to use the character memory system, we know how to use the dialog memory system, we know what to do when we create new characters, and we know how to rename a character, how to interactively rename a character, and how to use a new character's name in dialog text. So the only thing left to do for us is to go to main menu, go to dialogs, and wait for the next video. So that's everything for this video. In the next video, we will be looking into scene backgrounds so that we have some image displayed in the background to show us what the scene is like that we are currently playing through instead of a black background. And we will be using image choices so that we can then create the map that the player can click on to go to specific locations, because that's something that's rather relevant for sandbox games. So this is all from my side. I hope you have a great evening, and goodbye.